Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Becky with Malvern Books. We're thrilled to be with you this afternoon for a very special event featuring Doireann Ní Ghríofa and Alyssa Harad in reading and conversation of Doireann's new book, A Ghost in the Throat from Biblioasis Press. Following their discussion, we'll be taking audience questions if you'd like to enter them in the chat. Doireann Ní Ghríofa is a poet and essayist. A Ghost in the Throat was awarded the Irish Book of the Year and described as powerful by the New York Times and sumptuous by the Sunday Times. She is also author of 6 critically acclaimed books of poetry, each a deepening exploration of birth, death, desire, and domesticity. Awards for her writing include a Lannan Literary Fellowship in the US, the Ostana Prize in Italy, and the Rooney Prize for Irish Literature. Her most recent book of poems is To Star the Dark. Alyssa Harad is the author of a memoir, Coming to My Senses, and has published, has published essays in The Nation, Jewish Quarterly, O, the Oprah Magazine, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and other venues. She is currently writing a novel inspired by the lives and art of women associated with surrealism. Alyssa will be our moderator today, so I'll turn it over to her now. Alyssa.
Hello, everyone. We're going to start with a reading from Doireann, so I will be quiet and let that happen.
Thank you, Alyssa, and thank you to everyone at Malvern Books for hosting us this evening as it is here in Ireland, but I know you're in a different time zone there. I'm just going to read a little from the beginning of the book, just to give you a little flavour of what it's like. When we first met, I was a child, and she had been dead for centuries. Look, I am 11, a girl who is terrible at sums and at sports, a girl given to staring out windows, a girl whose only real gift lies in daydreaming. The teacher snaps my name, startling me back to the flimsy prefab. Her voice makes it a fine day in 1773 and sets English soldiers crouching in ambush. I add ditch water to drench their knees. Their muskets point towards a young man who is tumbling from his saddle now in slow, slow motion. A woman rides in to kneel over him, her voice rising in an antique formula of breath and syllable the teacher calls a queena, a keen to lament the dead. Her voice generates an echo strong enough to reach a girl in the distance with dark hair and bitten nails. Me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I wanted to start by talking a little bit about the genre of the book, which normally I would be totally uninterested in. Normally I find conversations about genre really boring, and I think that they should be left up to, marketing departments and whoever has to pick where the book goes on the shelf. But I have been really delighted by how baffling your book has been to the critics and the prize givers, and the way it keeps showing up in different categories. And I have a theory about why that is, so I'm going to test it out on you and see, see what you think. So some people treat this book as biography, and it definitely is partly a biography of the author of the poem that you become obsessed with, Eileen Dove. And some people treat it as memoir or autofiction, and there is a lot about you in here. But I think what it actually is it's the story of how this book got made, right? Yeah. And it begins with your third pregnancy and the compulsion that drew you, the compulsions and the context that drew you to Eileen Dove. And then it ends with the weaning of your fourth child and your husband's vasectomy. So when you sort of leave that, what I think of as the tunnel of domesticity. I don't have children, but I've seen many of my friends go into this tunnel and then sort of emerge 3 or 4 years later. And on page 119 on the UK edition, you say, milk was inextricable from my labors. My body responded to my daughter's hunger with a rush of milk, and then my mind responded to the milk by rushing back to the scattered jigsaw of Eileen Dove's days. Whenever I felt milk move along my inner paths of ducts and lobules, I thought of udders swaying along a dirt boreen towards a harp in the distance, its strings taut, still. In her sleep, my daughter gulped. So I just wanted to see if you thought that was right. You're free to reject my characterization of your book, of course. But also I wanted to hear a little bit about how you came to that form of the book, why you didn't just write a memoir or just try to write a biography. Like what was it that made you need to weave those two things together in such a striking way?
Thank you, Elise. That's your question. Just amazing. Where do I begin? I'm glad that you raised the element, I guess you could call it, of milk, because I'm often struck by the image of milk when people ask me, as they very, very often do, about the form of the book. And I often am tempted to reply, it's none of those genres. It's just a book about milk. It's milk. It's a milk book. It's a liquid book. The book is a vessel into which I pour all different kinds of liquid. And a lot of the liquid is milk, and me following a quest, and that quest occurs in parallel with my life in milk as it was at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel strange whenever I'm asked the question about form, because it seems to me like it's a story. It's the story of a quest, like so many books are, and that it's quite difficult to pin it into particular genres, but that in its essence, it's a story. It's a liquid story. It's a story I felt I was led on, and a story that I suppose a story that I'm pouring for readers, so that in its heart is what it is. And one of the reasons that I felt compelled to include elements, I suppose, of my own life as I was trying to seek more about the life of Eileen Dove Ní Ghríofa. One of the things that really inspired me to include my work, as they always say in maths lessons, was this book, which is called Mora Rua. I don't know if you can see it there. It's it's a really old history book, and it's by a woman called Maura MacNeil. It was published posthumously, and it's the story of a really powerful woman who lived in the west of Ireland in the 17th century. And it's quite a traditional biography, as Maura MacNeil wrote it. She was a very celebrated academic and scholar. And there's a beautiful portrait of her on the back, which I'm useless at this now. I won't be able to show her face. And it's actually, do you know what? You see the way there's a shine in her face there and you can't make out her features. That is actually perfect for what I'm trying to say right now, because that's essentially what she did. There's no I, there's no singular. Her story has been scrubbed from it. It's a very polished, smooth academic book, which is really compelling. But I found myself turning this book, Mora Rua, over again and again and looking at her and her face, which you can't see now, which I actually love. I didn't know that this was going to happen. But I kept looking at her face and wondering about how she found all this information, because I could feel that sense of urgency in the way that the book was written. And yet that was all hidden from me. And I wanted to meet her eye. I wanted to see her in her quest of finding out more about Moira Rua. And so when I sat to write my own effort of a biography of Eileen Dovney Connell, it felt important to me to give that to the reader and to be as open with the reader about my own life, my own struggles, my own small victories, as I was attempting to be about the life of the woman I was writing about. So I suppose to attempt that sense of generosity and openness within the book was really important to me. And Maura McNeill continues to be, I guess, a teacher of mine. I was a small child when she died, and as I go on in my life in writing, she becomes increasingly important to me. And I think that's really interesting, how we look towards the writers of the past and the artists of the past. And I know this is very familiar territory for you, Alyssa, with the book that you're writing at the moment, but we have so much to learn from those who have written and published and those who have gone before us, don't we? You know, and that's important to me in my work.
Yes. Well, I'm so glad that you did make that decision to show your work and include your own life. Because I have never read domesticity written about in this way. It was so striking to me. And I've been kind of like running around and pressing it on all my friends who have small children to say, like, please read this and tell me what you think, because I have heard women talk about the sort of endless to-do lists and the grind of mothering that I have seen. And I have seen a kind of sentimental portrait of that service where everything is very perfect and, you know, kind of the Instagram version of mothering. And I have read women who were oppressed by that drudgery and needed to get out from under it and needed to escape it. But I've never read what you wrote, which is a kind of a story about the seduction of those to-do lists. It's this almost, you are in love with these daily tasks and with this, or I say you, but whoever you are portraying in this book, we'll just say you for shorthand, knowing that it's much more complicated than that. But the narrator in this book is in love with her to-do lists and in love with that feeling of being in service to her family and to her children. Sometimes to the point of danger. And there's a certain precarity in this book that really gives the story a lot of tension. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about whether that was what you set out to record, because it seems like you're in the process of rescuing one woman from being erased from history at the same time that you're in danger of erasing yourself. Like the person in this book is in danger of erasing herself.
Yeah, that's absolutely, I think that's a really important part of the book. And that is something that I have felt often in my own life, the tug towards self-erasure. And I think that can take different forms, and that kind of equality in a person's being becomes quite dangerous when you're in charge of small children, and there are ways in which that can be expressed in a way that isn't necessarily a danger to others around you, but is you might argue, still quite the danger to the person who is engaging in those patterns of behavior. I often think of it like fog. Like, I think some of us find it quite difficult to be seen and prefer to step backwards into a kind of fog, and sometimes even to conjure a kind of fog in front of themselves, like that they're not quite being seen within their own selfhood. So I think that for me, at that point of my life in which I was expressing that experience, there was a tendency to become completely submerged in the ordinary day-to-day tasks of the work that I was doing. And to the extent where I felt myself barely visible at all, just churning through many, many to-do lists. And I think that that was part of the work that this book was attempting to do. I thought that I was hauling Eileen Dovney Connell back and trying to give her back her vividness and to sketch a picture of her standing vividly in her own life. And what she gave me, to a certain extent, was to haul me back as well, to say, okay, but you're coming with me, and you need to become more conscious of the fact that this is a pattern that you're doing. So I think I learned an awful lot from writing this book and from attending to the life of another woman very closely. And I think that's something that interests me a lot, is we tend to talk a lot about the books that we write and that are published, but it's much rarer that we attempt to articulate how those books have changed us in their creation, and the ways in which the books we try to write change our lives forever. And this book has absolutely changed me forever in many ways. And that's one important way that it changed me, was drawing my attention to that pattern that I had developed.
That's so interesting to me. And I want to hear more about how it's changed you, but also I want to ask you to expand a little bit on this ambivalence in the book about who is possessing who and who is haunting who, and the difference between, because this is something that I feel in my work as well and have thought a lot about, is whether I am being haunted and possessed by this person I'm writing about, and I'm in service to them, which is one way that you frame it in your book, or whether I'm a vampire, right? Whether I'm sort of using somebody else's life and somebody else's body of work to vivify myself and my own work. You use a different metaphor. You talk about yourself as a puppeteer, or at one point that where Eileen is like a marionette. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about the back and forth on that, in that ambivalence that you did, and how that went for you in the writing of the book, when you felt on one side or the other, where you are now.
So interesting that you ask that, because this is the question I've been asking myself again only today with the book that I'm attempting to write at the moment. And I'm just spending so many hours in the archives that, like, it's affecting my vision. Like, I got, for ages earlier, I couldn't quite focus my vision correctly. I was just getting so used to like scanning so many pages of ledgers and wondering and asking myself, I think when we're attempting biography, the question that echoes again and again for me is, how dare you? Like, how dare I attempt to recreate the fabric, the texture, the reality of someone else's days based on what? Ledgers and things that are ephemera to a real person's real lived life. And there's such audacity in that attempt. And I think it is important to hold tight to those questions of, who am I to attempt this? Because the act of questioning, I feel, tends to lead you deeper in the attempt towards biography. So I don't really know how to answer that question, because I'm still turning the same cartwheels. I'm totally incorrigible. I'm now attempting something even more ambitious, but like it's leading me even deeper.
Are you, you don't have to say what you're working on right now if you don't want to, but are you on the track of another female ghost?
Several, I would say. Several. Yeah, several. And at such an early stage of the next book that I almost don't even know yet what story I'm telling myself, if you know what I mean. I think that a lot of writers are familiar with that experience where you're just beginning and you're kind of following hunches all the time, aren't you? You're just like a magnet. You're like, oh, I think this could be the direction I'm going, and no, maybe this way. So I'm very, very early days, but yeah, it seems to be
yes, that is extremely familiar to me, and I have to say that it doesn't just happen to me at the beginning of the project. It happens periodically. Like I think I've got a hold of it, my arms are around it, and then oh whoops. It's like in a video game when you level up and all of a sudden you can see a whole new world and you're like, oh, now I know nothing at all anymore.
That is the perfect analogy for it, isn't it? That's exactly how dizzying it really feels. That dizzying, I think, always for me too.
Well, let's since you're already in the archives, let's talk a little bit about research, and especially about using the uncanny as a research method, using hunches, using intuition. This book is full of magic. It's full of these moments where that are also very familiar to me, where you go to a real place, you go to a place that you can find on a map, and then you get out of your car and you wander around and nothing much is happening, and then you begin to try to imagine the things that you've come to see that maybe are not visible to you. And then the world tilts a little bit and things happen. The little fragments appear in the dirt. There's an uprooted tree with a door in it that you can go through. And I just want you seem to be of two minds about these little moments. Like on the one hand, they're all through the book and they really do lead you places. So they're undeniable. But both in the book and in some of your interviews, I've heard you sort of distance yourself from them a little bit. Like, and I do this too, which is why I'm asking this question, where you I think one can be captured by those moments and they're very real, and then they had changed the course of the book. But also once you come out of them, you're like, oh, I'm not really a person who like, I'm not this woo-woo, I'm not that page on the internet with the sparkles and the fairies on it. Like I'm different. This is different. So can you talk a little bit about your relationship to those moments and the uncanny in general?
I can, and yeah, I do sometimes, I did question myself as I was writing the book. People won't believe that this really happened about a lot of elements of the book, and yet the moments that seem strangest, they really do just happen in the way that in ordinary life, sometimes strange things and strange coincidences do happen in ordinary life. And you find yourself asking yourself, did that really just happen? And like, for example, one of the moments that you described there at Doireann, near the house where Eileen Ní Ghríofa grew up, I came upon talk about climate change, a lot of the very old trees here in Ireland have been affected by the changes in weather, and then when a storm comes, really old oaks and that kind of thing will just blow over, which isn't something that we would have been familiar with, or that wouldn't be familiar with usually. But there's a tree in Doireann that had blown over when I came to visit Eileen Dove's childhood home, and its roots were kind of like torn up and into the air, and showed what was a gateway in an old stone wall, where obviously the tree had engulfed this structure, and then when the tree fell over it became visible again. And I crawled on my hands and knees through this gap in it, and thought to myself as I was writing about that, it was quite, it felt as though that was entering a portal, in terms of that it was leading me along the book at that stage, and that Eileen Dove was leading me towards where I needed to go next. And I thought as I was writing that moment, people will think that this is a moment that I've embellished in some way. And yet people have, since the book was published, a lot of people have started to go to different locations in the book. So people have gone to Doireann and often post photos of that tree with the the portal in it. So like, it's just so interesting to me to see that kind of thing, that the book in so many ways has astonished me and continues to astonish me. Like, it astonishes me that I'm here speaking to all of you now. It just seems so far-fetched and difficult to believe that people would be reading this book and responding to it, and it's such a gift. This book has been such a gift and has brought me on so many strange swerves, and I'm so grateful to that and to everyone who's read it.
Did you ever feel frightened or oppressed by the liveliness of Eileen's presence, like when you had these experiences?
No, funny enough, no. I was never scared of her. I was a bit scared of her mother. When I found her mother's grave in the island graveyard in Doireann, which you can walk to at low tide, and it's really beautiful. I recommend it if you ever find yourself in the west of Ireland and looking for an adventure. But her grave there, I felt very strong kind of sense of her presence when I stood at that grave. And like I say in the book, my hair slaps me in the face, and I really felt that of the person I was attempting to write about turning around and just being like, how dare you don't know, or like that Elliot thing, that's not what I meant at all,
yeah.
And that sense of goosebumps of kind of going like, well, what am I doing here? This isn't right, that I'm trying to tell someone's story who possibly doesn't want their story to be told in the way that I'm attempting to tell it. So that kind of ambivalence, I think, is interesting to the reader, actually. I know it's interesting for me when I encounter it in other people's writing. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I have encountered resistance. And I know a lot of other people who have encountered resistance. I've talked to a lot of researchers who had uncanny experiences where they lost work, lost photographs, but also were directed to places. And I wonder if part of it is just the way that when you have a single subject that you're so focused on, the whole world kind of becomes charged with meaning, so that everything starts to be a metaphor or a sign. Does that resonate with you?
Yes, it does, Alyssa. Like, that's exactly how it felt to me when I was attempting to follow Eileen Dove and see where she would lead me and what she would reveal of her life. Now, I will say that here in Ireland, and to a certain extent in England and Scotland and Wales, her poem Queen Arthur Lyra, which was what first drew me to her, to trying to find out more about her life, right? her poem would be studied quite widely here. Like, it's considered part of our literary canon, and as I say in the book, many other people have translated it over the years, and the poem itself has been subject to a lot of study and is often taught in school and in university. And I think that's part of the reason why I found it so astounding that there wasn't more information about her life, you know, and what had happened to her both before and after composing the poem, you know, and that was part of what sparked my curiosity. But we have here a phrase in the Irish language, cloch le carn, which speaks to one of our traditions that in an honoring of someone's life, someone who has died, that we will often, as we're passing a certain place that's important to them, or like occasionally historically where like they may have been buried, but like these days more so a place that was important to them, that there will be a stone left there, that everyone who passes will add another stone until there's like a huge mound of stones, and that's an act of remembering, but also an act of honoring someone's memory as it I guess as it belongs to you, that the memory of a person, or how important a person has been to you in your life. And when I think of eighteenth Ní Ghríofa, there's so many stones that have been laid to her cairn, you know, and that continues. So many writers have attended to her voice as it occurs in her poem, and have translated it to English and to other languages. And I feel like A Ghost in His Throat is just one other pebble added to that already substantial pile, and it really speaks to what an important woman eighteenth Ní Ghríofa was, and that will continue, you know. Like, I'm so convinced that this book will lead more people to the poem who maybe hadn't encountered it until this point, and that someone of those readers will find out some of the missing jigsaw pieces that I wasn't successful in finding, and that other people haven't quite found yet. But that there are further, that there are more people who will come to this story, and come to the story for her life, and come to her words, and will explore it in ways that we haven't even thought of yet, and that will discover more of her, and that cairn, that the cloch le cairn, that will grow and grow and grow, and I take great hope from that. You know, I don't feel like this is my subject, this is my book, this is mine in any way at all. Like, it's the opposite. If anything, I feel like, you know, she has been subject of so many people's thought and work, and that will continue. And I love that about her. So maybe that's why I never felt what you're describing, that sense of her as a subject slamming the door in my face. Maybe she's just used to people going along and poking around, like Janet Malcolm says, poking around the underwear drawer, you know.
Well, I think maybe there's something else there too, and it is something I wanted to ask you about, which is that part of how this happened, that there's a poem that's completely canonical, but an author who's exiled from the canon in some ways, is that the poem was a part of an oral tradition for a long time before it was written down. And you say that, but then I never quite could put my finger on the process of that. Is it that she was thought to have composed the poem orally? Did she say it aloud? And then, and who was listening? And then how did they know to repeat it to the point where it got to your honor? What was her name?
Nari
Singleton.
Yes,
Nari Singleton. Nari
Singleton. Nora.
in her cottage, writing it down.
Yes. So Queen Artí Lyra is it's a lament poem, and when it was first composed by eighteenth Ní Ghríofa, it was spoken by her in a moment of great anguish in her life, when she had discovered the body of her husband, who had been murdered in an ambush. And she spoke this Queen over his body. And the Queena, the poem itself, occurred in a form that would have been familiar to her as she was growing up and as a young woman, because she would have been part of this oral tradition. She would have heard other women performing famous quinta and also composing new quinta, because her mother, Máire Ní Ghríofa, was one of the most celebrated practitioners of this literary art. So it wouldn't have been unfamiliar to her. And there are certain tropes and repetitions and certain metrics to the form which would have enabled someone like Eileen Dove to speak her grief
I see.
into this very particular historic form. So it was recognized from very early on. She performed, or I shouldn't say performed, she spoke it over her husband's body. And then it said that she spoke it at his wake. And it's kind of a convoluted part of the story, but he ended up being buried several times in different locations due to, it's quite a long story, but anyways, she spoke it when he was being buried in Kilcrea Abbey as well. So in those repetitions, it would have been heard by others, and they began to memorize it and to speak it to further people. Now it's an art form that was really practiced by women, learned by women, spoken by women. It's a very, I guess that's just an inherent part of this element of our literary culture. It was practiced by women. And so these women began to learn this quina, as well as the other quinta that they would have already known by heart. This was another one that they brought into their canon of oral literature, which wasn't necessarily ever transcribed. Eileen Dove Ní Ghríofa's quina, Queen Arthur Lear, was so well thought of that there came a point where it was transcribed and translated to English, and at the point where it was put in print. From then on, really, it was anthologized and it was retranslated, and it was just disseminated so widely, and it became part of the literary canon. So that's kind of how it occurred. For a long, long time, it was learned by heart, recited, and in a way, like I describe in the book, that's a source of great astonishment and just awe for me to imagine that works of literature can live within the human body. They can be learned by heart and spoken, and learned by heart and spoken, and heard and learned by heart and spoken, and that just seems extraordinary. I love that, but I suppose I'm just really fascinated by literary culture all around the world anyway, so yeah, I love that about it.
Thank you so much for giving me some more of the details, because I was really I was, the thing that was puzzling me the most was when did she say this, and now I'm even more amazed to know that this is something that came out of her really in that moment of extreme grief and emotion. And then that she was able to retain it and repeat it. When women shared these keens with each other, were they sharing them as stories that they were telling, or were they remembering? Like the story of Art O'Leary is very political. He's I imagine an important figure of standing up against colonialism, standing up against the authority of the British at the time and the penal laws. What were they doing when they were repeating it to each other?
In terms of what kind of register would it have been delivered in?
Yeah, I'm just trying to imagine them, like,
yeah,
were they sitting
some people have suggested that these quinta would have been sung, that there was an element of song involved. Other people say no, it's poetry. So like what we would say here, recitation, that it was an act of reciting for a group of people. And that would be an important, or would have been, and is in some parts of the country here, still in Ireland, an important part of our culture. Going on court is what we call it, that the community would gather in different people's house every evening, and that different people would stand up and I guess do a party piece, that there would be poetry, that there would be song, and that this would be an element like that where people would gather and different quinta would form part of that kind of spine, I guess, of oral literature, that would be something that a woman might choose to speak. Like, I'll do this queen this evening, stand up and would perform Queen Arthur Lyra while other people were listening.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I wonder if this this dynamic where this extremely intimate poem that was tied to a very specific incident, but then carried by this much wider group of women, like that seems like it's a core dynamic in your book as well. Like these intimate things that you're recording and thinking about in order to sort of open them up and disseminate them and have them be sung and repeated and embodied by all the people who have your book now. Like you joined that lineage. It's really amazing.
I mean, I'm as amazed as anyone, but particularly because a lot of the time that I was writing this book, I wrote it on the roof of a free multi-story car park near my children's school. And so I would park on the roof. No one else ever bothers going as far as the roof in this car park. So I was always on my own there. And a huge part of writing this book wasn't necessarily writing it, it was speaking it out loud to myself again and again and again. So I had a really strong sense of it as almost like an oral text in itself, or I don't know if you could say text even, but like almost like an oral work. That I felt often like I was composing it rather than necessarily just writing it down. And a lot of it was the acoustics of every line became really important to me, and sometimes almost that was something that I had to be particularly attentive to when I was editing it, because I was so used to speaking it that my ears sometimes like can kind of go a little bit overboard. So sometimes in some of the edits I was trying to bring that down a little, but there's large parts of the paragraphs of prose that still sound like poetry to me, and I guess that makes sense because I am a poet, and I feel like your poetic voice makes itself felt whether or not you're attempting to control it, and I feel like I am who I am as a writer. That's how I write using my ear as much as anything else. So that became part of it too, and I think that the fact that so many readers have responded to the way in which it's written, well, when I was saying it out loud again and again, I could feel like that sense of that someday there'll be a reader who picks this up and hears it through the text.
That's so beautiful. It's like you were issuing this call and imagining the response.
That's exactly how it felt, and yet that's always an act of faith, isn't it, Alyssa? Like, you don't know that there'll be anyone there to hear it, that anyone will come and listen, and it really does feel miraculous that, every time I meet someone who's read the book, I'm just like, wow, what, you read it? It just and I thought after a while I would just get used to that, but no, still it's crazy.
I want to remind everybody that if you have any questions, you should put them in the chat. We have about 10 minutes left, so it's now or never. get them in there, or I'm just going to take up the whole time. You said earlier that you felt like the book had really changed you. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like how do you feel like you're different now on the other side of it? There's probably a lot of ways, because it's not just the book, but the reception and how your access maybe to different opportunities and all kinds of things.
Yeah, I find it more difficult to see the latter part of your question, I think, because it almost feels like I can't let myself see it, because that feels quite like that idea of fog again, that could just all disappear in a haze, but what feels very, I mean, in terms of prizes and that kind of thing, that just, I don't think you can spend too much time thinking about that. And I don't think you carry anything like that with you to the desk, or to your subject. I think that's external, there's the writing, there's the work we do when we're writing, and then there's all the other stuff. And I think that reception and things like that is all part of that part of the equation. Now, readers, that's different as far as I'm concerned, but I think culturally, being Irish, whenever I think of the reader, I really do think of that sense of being in a room and standing up and saying a poem for a group of like 6 or 7 people and having that one-to-one eye contact with people. So the reader, the individual reader, is so precious to me. But in terms of the other elements of reception, I don't linger too long on that, to be honest.
Has it given you talk a lot in this book about your struggle to feel a sense of permission in pursuing this work outside of the academy, and which, as a former member of the academy, I just want to applaud anybody who's doing that work outside the academy, because we really need you. But do you feel more of a sense of permission or confidence to pursue things that you might not have otherwise attempted, having completed this book?
I like it's so interesting, because I think just as a person, I tend to be quite hard on myself, and I don't know if I can ever change that. So I think no matter what I embark on, I'll probably always have the voice that's saying, you can't do this. What are you thinking? So I don't know if that will ever go. And yet, this book has really shown me how much an ordinary person like me can discover when they decide to fling themselves into the study of history. And how when one is passionate and curious about someone else's life, there's a lot that can be found, and that there are many, many tools at our disposal, and that, okay, some of it is skill, and that's fine. That's the kind of skill that anyone who's used to navigating the internet can teach themselves, the skills of that kind of research, of engaging with archives, of figuring out where information is, of seeking permissions and filling forms and going in and just reading until you find what you need. But there are other tools as well. There's intuition is so important, and it's easy to overlook that if you allow yourself to become totally focused on your own self-doubt. You're thwarting yourself then, and you're thwarting your attempt at biography and your attempt to learn someone else's life. So yes, I think studying Eileen Dovney Connell's life and coming to know her has taught me a lot about the first set of skills and where to begin and how to go about seeking historical information, and has given me confidence in attempting that, but has also taught me that the other skills are very, very important too, and to follow my gut, and to seek out wherever the hunches are leading me, to keep following that. And to be careful of self-doubt, because I myself can be my own worst enemy. I think that comes across quite strongly in A Ghost in the Throat. I don't think that'll be news to anybody who has read the book.
Well, we're all really glad that you have not menaced yourself too much, because we're so happy to have your work. We are getting some questions, so I'm gonna come over here and see what they are. Let's see. Oh, ooh, I like this one. So Orla Cubit says,
I can see Orla waving there. Hi, Orla. Nice to meet you.
Hi, Orla. Alyssa spoke earlier about how the book defies genre. You described it as a milk book, which I love. I wonder if you think of it as a mystic text. And also, can you tell us more about what that one's for me.
Yes, is that about what you're writing about? I agree with Orla. I would love you to talk more about that.
Okay.
Because you've given a few little hints, and I'm very eager to hear more.
Well, I think you should answer the question first about it being whether or not you think it's a mystic book. I think it's a mystic book.
I do think it's a mystic book. I think you're right, Orla. I feel that it is quite mystical, and like you were saying earlier about the scene where I'm kind of like giving out about woo-woo stuff. I'm learning to just accept that I'm into mystical stuff, and I find that really interesting. I find it interesting to follow the mystical urge and see where it will lead you. And in what ways, Alyssa, do you feel that is coming across in your book?
This will allow me to ask you to sneak in another question, actually. So I'm writing a novel, and it's loosely based on Leonora Carrington's life, and also some people that I've made up, and a lot of the people that were in her general milieu. But also, like, there's a singing hyena in it. So it's not as straightforward. Leonora, I think we all know now, to my shock and surprise, everybody knows this now, because no one knew who she was when I started working on her, that she herself is a very fantastical and magical person. And so when I started to have those feelings of being a vampire, or like using her, and I felt resistance from her ghost in many striking ways that I will save for later, some later event to tell you about. My response was to go towards her art, and towards the worlds that she had created, and to think about why she created them and what the historical circumstances were that she created them under. So it is in many ways a book about the necessity of magic and art in the face of trauma and history.
My God, I love that.
So I think you can see why I was like, oh my God, I got your book. Because all of these strategies of looking to the margins, of having to trace the presence of people who were erased from history by reading, what's written about somebody who's more famous, and then kind of looking for these little crumbs and erasing the main story until you can see the form of their lives. That is all so familiar to me. Less so now. I've been working on it for quite a long time, which is the other thing that made me really excited about your book, is how long you worked on it. I was like, okay, it's okay. It's going to get done.
Actually, that brings to mind what you were saying there. I don't know if you've read maybe they have it in Malvern, I'm sure they do. Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments by Celia
Yes.
Hartman. Wow. And the whole idea that she has of critical fabulation, of beginning and gathering your set of facts and then untethering them and seeing where they'll fly. I'm reading it at the moment. I'm only about halfway through and I'm just
Yeah.
captivated by
It's
it.
it's an incredible book, and it's something that I really wish had existed when I wrote my dissertation, which was all about ghosts and hauntings and how to bear witness to something that isn't really there. And so yeah, I'm super excited by her work and by a lot of the work that's being done in the academy right now around absences and and hauntings. But I was curious why you say in the book that you felt a real resistance to portraying things that you didn't have the documentation for. You do a lot of imagining and embellishing, conjuring up. But then there are somehow these places where you're like, no, I don't really know enough to do that. And to imagine that would be a form of theft, you say. And I obviously went in like the totally opposite direction where I was like, there are all these blanks. So instead of attempting a biography, I'm going to just write fiction, which is, you know, a way you could have gone. And I was curious about why you didn't go that direction.
Well, you know, it's interesting, isn't it? And another thing that we hardly ever speak about once a book is published is all the different forms that book took as we went through the various drafts. And we thought at one stage, maybe it's this. Oh no, I have to rewrite it all as this. No, now it's this. And that sense of almost like ping pong back and forth of trying to figure out which form, which direction. There was one stage with this book where the last chapter was called 10 Endings, and there were 10 different, some cleaving very closely to historical fact, others completely fictional, and there were 10 alternative endings that I had written to the book.
Wow.
So yeah,
I want to read them all. Send them to me immediately.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Like, I mean, I think a book slowly reveals itself as what it wants to be, and I feel like sometimes publishing as an industry can push us too quickly along that path, and it means that we think the book has become its final form, but it might not be quite there yet, and it's impossible to know unless you have time. So is a long way of saying that I think you're very wise to take things slowly with your own book and to follow it, you know, because you never know. And imagine getting to a stage where it's published and you're looking back and saying, I wish I'd had another year to see what it would have revealed of itself. Like no one wants that.
Well, you're very kind. Sometimes I think that authors who do that then go and write another book, which makes them much more productive than I am. But it has been super interesting. And I thought about this with your book too, that I realize we should be coming to an end soon, but I can't quite let you go yet. That one thing that has been interesting for me is that I was writing about, you know, the 30s and 40s in Europe and people who had to live in exile and the rise of fascism during a period of time when fascism was rising. And so in some ways, my slowness in completing the book has allowed me to live through this period of time in history that has so much resonance with the historical work that I was doing. And you were writing during those years as well. And I wondered how much the history around you affected the work that you were doing, because there's a lot happening. I mean, not only in the world, but in Ireland and you know where you were.
Yeah, I mean it's really complicated. I feel like when we're writing from within our own milieu, and sometimes, speaking from my own life, sometimes I'm intensely conscious of the forces that are at play around me as I'm writing, and I feel really drawn to articulating that within the text, whether directly or indirectly. Other times I feel a really strong urge to go against that in some way.
Interesting.
And I think there's that tug of war within me of grappling in a direct way and of focusing on what appears to be the task at hand. But it's never clear cut as the task at hand, because it's always inflected and coloured by what's occurring politically in the life that the writer is living, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah. I think, like, because a lot of the historical, like, to use the example that you've given of attending to the 30s and 40s in Europe and then living through current times, particularly in America, for me, when I was looking back at the time of the penal laws here in Ireland, it was a time of great repression. It was a key moment really in the colonization of Ireland pre-famine. And certainly as you're looking towards the past, you become much, much, much more conscious of the ways in which those same forces are currently at play in the world and in the society around you at the same time. So became hyper conscious of the ways in which those colonial forces and the repercussions of them are still being felt and are still being dealt.
Mm-hmm.
I don't mean dealt with, but I mean dealt as blows.
Yes.
Currently, and the ways in which that time of a great oppression here in Ireland is still occurring so many other places around the world, and that we tend to talk about history as though it's past, but it's not. It's just repeating and occurring in different ways all the time and all around us. And I think, like a lot of people as well, climate change was a huge part of what I was considering in terms of that tug of war and in writing the book. And I'm sure for any artist or writer, there's that sense of, to what extent do you invite forces of politics, history, and those kind of enormous global forces into the art that you're attempting to make? And I think that's something I'm still figuring out. But certainly that it makes, for me, I'm hyper aware of the ways in which things are repeating, patterns are repeating constantly, so yeah, I don't think I've answered that question very well, sorry.
No, you really did. And I think so much of your work seems to be built on patterns of both sound and imagery, that it's interesting to think about the way that the patterns are narrative and historical as well, these repetitions of incidents and emotion that as they occur both in the book and then in the context in which it was written. It is after 2:00 our time. So
Alyssa,
yes.
if you have a few more minutes, there were
Yes.
a few questions in
Sure.
the chat that were kind of all, I kicked it off and then other people have asked the questions all relating to the, I'm going to say it wrong, Quinta, and so the first question was from me, are there other Quinta, we say it wrong, I'm sorry, that are printed and quoted widely, especially by her mother that you mentioned? That was the first one. And then the other one, to add on to my question, was, Megan had said, is it common for lament poems by women to be transcribed and saved, or is it more like historical and literary traditions where women's voices are forgotten or deliberately discarded? And then there's another question after that, but those two first, and then there's another one about music and stuff. So it's kind of, if you have a few minutes to kind of just address.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I'll answer the last part of the last question first. Yeah, it's unfortunately, the there's just a small amount of the quinta that would have been composed have been preserved. But in a funny way, I guess that makes them all the more precious. The fact that they have succeeded in surviving against all odds, and that we still have examples of the Queen, and for anyone who's interested in finding out more about these quinta and about lament poetry in general and keen poetry, I would recommend if you Google Angela Burke, she has done some brilliant scholarship, particularly comparing the ways in which this tradition occurred in Ireland and the ways in which there were examples of it in Scottish literary tradition. It's really interesting. And she compares them, and she has big lists of the ones that are extant. So you'll be able to go back and forth if you're curious about that. But in terms of how many have survived, I mean, it was something that I kept circling back to as I was writing A Ghost in the Throat. The more I found out about Eileen Duffy Connell's life, and the more I found out about the time in her life that led up to her composing the Queen and its aftermath, the more astonished I was, really, that it succeeded in finding its way to us. Like, it really is a literary miracle, as far as I'm concerned, that we have it, that anyone who picks up A Ghost in the Throat, when they finished reading the book, that the entire Queen by Eileen Duffy Connell is published at the back of the book. So any reader who picks it up can see her words in the Irish language as she would have spoken them. And that to me is just, I mean, I can't even think about it too much because it's so emotional. I just can't believe, they're translating at the moment to all kinds of languages. It's going to be published around the world. And the fact that Eileen Duffy Connell's poems will be available in, South Korea or Brazil, it just seems amazing. And I think it harks back to that, to what I was saying earlier, that her voice will continue on regardless. Her Queen has survived this long, and we're fortunate to have it now, during our lives, and it'll survive long after us as well, and it will continue and continue, and that just brings me great joy.
That's beautiful.
Were there other questions, Becky?
There was another one on the same topic about Angeleska said, I love hearing about the lyrical lament at the heart of this book and the tradition of keening. I wonder if you sing or play music.
Oh, that's a good question.
She says, I was raised in a family of folk musicians who play traditional Irish music.
Wow.
Her dad is I can't pronounce this, Uline Piper.
An Aylin Piper. Yeah.
Piper, and I am a Sean-Nós singer.
Oh, very good. Yeah, Sean-Nós. Becky, you're going to have a degree in the Irish language from the end of this.
No, my husband is Irish, so I'm Irish American by marriage.
It's in the blood.
That's right, because he gets to me. So I'm very interested in the way music might have informed this text or not.
Music certainly informed the text. I really, really wish that I was musical. I don't play any instruments, and I sing all the time, but I have just an unbearable voice. My poor children have to put up with me singing at the top of my voice all the time, anytime I'm driving them anywhere, and I'd say they could do without that, really. But I can't remember who I read at some stage, or someone said to me that all poets are frustrated singers, and that's what drives the lyric impulse, is the fact that we want to be able to sing, we want to be able to express ourselves through song, and because it's a frustrated impulse that we're driven elsewhere. I don't know if there's truth in that, but no, unfortunately I don't have those kind of talents like you do. I wish I did. And you're so fortunate to have them, particularly Sean-Nós singing. Wow, it's beautiful.
I think that's the last one on there, but over to you, Alyssa.
Thank you, Becky.
I was just going to bring us home and say that I think this book is full of music, and I definitely hear it when I read it. So you have succeeded. And thank you so much for being so generous with your time and for visiting us all the way over here in Texas to share this conversation and the reading of the book. We so appreciate it. Everyone, please buy a book for yourself or your friends from Malvern, and so we can all spread the good word. And do you have anything to say that you need to say, Becky?
I just want to, again, like you, just add my thanks to both of you so much for, Doireann, your book is just amazing. And Lisa, that you brought it to us here at Malvern Books to have us host this event is just wonderful. We're so very pleased with that. We're so happy to be able to do this. And so many people joined. It was amazing. And we have seen in the chat, there's comments